and welcome to My Security TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly and our Tuesday afternoon edition. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with My Security Media, and today we're going to be looking at semiconductors and be joined by Professor James Rabeau and also Andrew Wilson, who's the CEO with Senetas. Capabilities, opportunities and challenges in the global supply chain is what we're going to be discussing, and if you've got any interest in this field, we'd love to hear from you as well. Let me just walk through our slides. I mentioned we've got Andrew Wilson, and this follows on a release from Senetas. It's an ASX-listed company, and their announcement of the first quantum-resistant network encryption capability. So we'll hear more about Senetas, and there is a link between Professor Rabeau and Senetas also in this space. Let me bring in Professor Rabeau. Make sure I'm just going to start calling him James. James, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
Great. I'm glad everything is working. And let me just double check before we start. So, James, I've got sort of the front page of a report, and this is what we're going to this is sort of stemmed your appearance here with us today, is the release of this report, December, just before Christmas, on the Australian Semiconductor sector study from the University of Sydney. Yeah, definitely over to you. You're a professor of physics, so you've got quite an interesting background, both commercial and academic and research. So I'll hand over to you at least to give a bit of a background, and then we'll dive into the report, because it's a big topic on supply chain and the chipsets and semiconductors.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, firstly, just for the opportunity to talk about the report and be on the show. It's a great pleasure. So let me just say a little bit about myself first. I am firstly a professor in physics. I do research in quantum physics, and more specifically, I'm working on applied quantum technology, so developing technologies that rely on quantum physics, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later. The other hat I wear at the university is I'm deputy director at the Sydney Nano Institute, which is an institute of people and capability at the University of Sydney, which focuses on nanotechnology, and semiconductors definitely falls within that space. So it's very much as part of that role and my role to promote industry engagement and innovation that has led me to be a part of this semiconductor study. Maybe also just saying that I'm fortunate that these two roles overlap quite substantially, and especially with the semiconductor work that we did.
Could I maybe just while you're on that, what's the scale at the university in terms of sort of the School of Physics and the amount of researchers that you might have going? How big is the program and the Nano Institute?
Well, the School of Physics is the oldest physics school in Australia. I think number of faculty is of order 50. And in terms of the Sydney Nano Institute, I mean, the Sydney Nano Institute spreads across the entire university. So we have people from social sciences, from engineering, from all the science schools, business. So that, the numbers in terms of our membership is in the hundreds and growing. The Sydney Nano Institute is a fairly young 4 or 5 year old institute here. In terms of research, I mean, to be honest, the School of Physics has a lot in astrophysics, material science. We're very, very good at quantum. We have some excellent, we have Microsoft are here building a quantum computer. We have a startup company called Q Control, which was founded by a faculty member here. So there's quite a bit of activity, both in terms of research and commercialization, which is a great mix to have right now.
And hence the sort of the link back to the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer is this the first report of its kind for semiconductors?
Well, in my career, yes, but I was reflecting earlier that things go in cycles, and I think that there's been interest in this sort of on a rolling basis of 15 to 20 years of, well, what can we do in semiconductor? But let me just say a little bit about our connection with the Office of the Chief Scientist and how this whole thing came about. You pointed out that my background is fairly diverse. I have worked for about 8 years in between academic roles. I worked in industry, so I've got a broad range of experience, and for me, it's really exciting to try to tie the two together. And when I started in this role in 2019, there was a bit of interest around semiconductors. I mean, just people sort of saying, well, we don't have much capability in Australia. What could we do differently? Where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities? And it was when the chief scientist for New South Wales, Hugh Durrant-White, got involved and really said, yeah, actually, I think this is important, and I think there's an opportunity here at least to explore. So we were given a little bit of funding to undertake a scoping exercise, and that started small, but last year we really got into it more deeply, and we brought on an excellent consultant, Glenn Downey, from the Maltby Group, who went about really bringing a good business and economics lens to the tech side that I was perspective that I was bringing in. And we spoke to more than 100 different startup companies, SMEs, individuals, researchers across the country, and in government, and formed that culminated into this report that we published late last year.
Now, what I wanted to do is at least bring up sort of one of the figures. We've got some key figures here, and without scaring the audience too much, but let me just bring this up, and maybe if you can walk us through, because I think one of the things we were going to touch on is semiconductors and the markets. They touch everything. Basically, most pieces of technology, something from the report is a modern car will have up to 40 sort of chipsets within it as well. And you just mentioned the economics around this and the business approaches and the impacts of this. Could you maybe this sort of outlines the global market, and this is 2019, and I will increase it so we're talking, maybe just talk us through this specifically as to the semiconductors and the supply chain overall. I mean, this is a value chain, for example.
Yeah. Well, just taking it up even a level above this, Chris, semiconductors, they're electronics, they're electronic devices, and they're based on transistors, which were invented in the late 40s. So we have something that was invented and was large, like, the size of a coffee cup, from the pictures that I've seen, was the very first transistor, to the point where those were developed and miniaturized to the point where today you have billions of these transistors on a tiny millimeter scale chip. And the usefulness of these has grown substantially. And one of the things that we mentioned in the report is that the number of chips in a modern car is several hundred, compared to even 10, 20 years ago when it was only a handful. So yeah, the value chain, by the way, I may go on, jump in, interrupt me if you want to steer it.
No, go for it. And likewise with the audience, if they're watching and they want to cover on anything particular, but yeah, keep going, James.
Yeah, well, I mean, I learned a great deal as a physicist in this whole process. And the value chain, looking at the semiconductor industry as a value chain is incredibly important, and will be crucial for us to identify where we can play a role, where Australia can play a role. And I won't go into details on this slide itself, but I'll just say that, I mean, the beginnings of a semiconductor really starts from what's in the ground, the materials that are pulled out of the ground, silica, and create the silicon wafers, eventually give us the wafers that then are grown on, are manufactured into an actual electronic chip. The important parts of the value chain are the design. So and each of these exists either in isolation or in combination. So we have design, fabrication, and packaging are the big three areas that sort of go from end to end, that where what spits out the end is something that's usable. Mm-hmm. And integration into a piece of equipment, for instance, and then you have sales and distribution, all of that stuff that, in my technical mind, I don't really care about those things out there, but they're important, obviously. I think talking a little bit about value chain in the context of the big players is useful. Apple, for example, is what Apple, Intel, you would refer to them as an integrated device manufacturer, and they're the type of company who have the capital, the people power, and the networks and connections to be able to do the whole end-to-end of that value chain. They can design, they can fabricate, they may outsource a little bit here and there, they can package and sales and distribute and own the whole process. Now that's a bit rare because it's capital intensive and it's everything intensive. There's other companies that at the other end of the spectrum, this amazing story, which I think is also worth looking at, is in Taiwan. Taiwan currently are probably one of the biggest players in semiconductor manufacturing. They're the biggest player in semiconductor manufacturing, and influence globally. They have an influence globally. And to think that in 1990, Taiwan had no semiconductor industry whatsoever. This is a country that's got the same population as Australia. They had no semiconductor capability whatsoever, and there was a decision made and an examination of the value chain like we're talking about right now, a look at what Taiwan had to offer, and they homed in on, well, they decided strategically that we should invest in a fabrication capability, a fabrication plant. And that's grown to be what's called Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, TSMC, Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, and they're the biggest fabricator. They provide globally. They're building a plant in the U.S. right now, and that company focuses on a narrow slice of the value chain, that manufacturing piece, and they go deep, narrow. It's a high capital investment, fairly small margins, but they do it very well and very cleanly. And so, we couldn't compete with. No one can really compete with them now. So that kind of rules that out. If you get my drift about thinking about the value chain and where we might play. Yeah, those are just a few examples.
Well, just on Taiwan, I take it they don't have the raw materials like we do here in Australia, right?
Well, that's right. I think I don't know exactly where their supply chain originates from, but they would have to source that from distributed places around the world.
Now I mentioned Taiwan briefly at the start in terms of the current risk around Taiwan, and you mentioned it's the largest sort of manufacturer in the market for semiconductors. And then if you have a look at this, for 4,000 billion, I think that's $4 trillion in terms of the market size in the devices and the industries. It's a critical sector. The one other question I had, and we will come back to that supply chain and the overall sort of opportunities that might create for Australia. You mentioned silicon. What's happening in is it the graphite sector as well? Is there much change there?
I guess in the context of what this report focuses on, graphene and graphite is such a small portion. But having said that, there is a company, a startup company here in Sydney that is looking at graphene in a quantum computing context as a material for quantum computing.
Okay.
Certainly lots of scope for that to grow.
No worries. Well, look, the next one, and it's pretty clear, this is a very good figure in terms of that value chain. It's from that 100 billion up to 4,000 billion, and you can pretty much pick your spot in that. Are we strong? Before we move over to the next slide, are we strong in any of these already? Where would Australia be sort of sitting if we were talking about our strengths?
Okay, that's a really good question. So part of the study was, I mean, the main objectives of the study were twofold. Where are we now? What do we like now in Australia? And secondly, what is the opportunity? Where could we be? We learned a lot talking to all the people that we spoke to. The technology and the materials are spread out pretty broadly in Australia. So you have needs in a whole bunch of different spaces in the companies that we spoke to. We don't have a great deal. Well, we don't have we don't have anything close to what a piece of TSMC would look like. But there are a few. There's a company called Solana who's been around for a long time who do growth, but it's nothing that would be a provider for a broad spectrum of companies. So what we found is that the majority of companies in Australia are what you would call a fabless company. So I mentioned earlier about an integrated device manufacturer like an Apple who can do the whole gambit, the whole spectrum. A fabless company have a good idea for a device. They have great designers. They hire designers in. This is a low capital infrastructure type of play. You design your chip required for the device or the technology that you're developing. Then you offshore that. You send that away to get it manufactured. Potentially, you send it to another place to get it. This, by the way, gets to the crux of, I think, our opportunity. So I'll expand a bit. So you design something, you send it off to a company to have it fabricated, and then it might need to go to another specialist company to have it packaged and put into a chip that then you can put into a circuit board. So then typically that would come back, you do testing and then integration to your final product and sales and so on. So that's how what a fabless company looks like. And it was, if I may, I'll just elaborate on how this kind of sort of points to an opportunity in that there are a lot of these companies who were outsourcing and had the fairly high overhead of building their own networks and interacting with companies that could do fabrication. In many cases, a startup company might have a need, and they can't just ring up TSMC and say, "Hey, can we jump into your fabrication line and get this chip made?" TSMC will say, "You're just a speck of like you're meaningless in terms of our." A meaningless impact on our revenue stream. We need to deal with the Apples and the Microsofts and so on. So there's not a lot of weight that small companies carry. So it's this kind of notion of having the network and having having the overheads of having to deal with interacting and moving things around, that the opportunity emerges of having something that's like a bureau service. So what if we low capital, low risk, what if the country decided to say, well, let's start a small entity of some well-connected individuals running it to be a bit of a broker or a bureau service so that we have, 50 companies in Australia channeling their business through this broker and then outsourcing, offshoring and organizing it in that way.
As a collective.
As a collective. And importantly, the thing that's so important is that we have to be thinking long term. This will seed innovation. This will seed new companies to say, well, actually, I do want to start my company and stay in Sydney because I have access to this capability over here, and rather than going overseas. And then, all these aspects that we do cover in the report, they grow, they help each other. So the ecosystem starts to grow, the talent pool starts to grow. And
you say long term, but that doesn't mean sort of 20 years, as you say, Taiwan going since 1990. I'm just going to bring this up. And kill that. This is kind of what you were talking about in terms of the fabrication and the opportunities there. There are companies there already in terms of that. So the report is quite granular in terms of it actually looking at the market here in Australia. It's quite, even the references at the back. Cochlear is mentioned several times. It does seem to be a real leader out there as well. Any kind of standouts that you saw from this? And this is the representative Australian participation in the semiconductor global value chain. Any standouts?
Yeah, I think you're right. It does go granular. There's a lot of intelligence in this report that would have spillover impact in other technologies. So it's a good read.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that sense, I mean, to me, one of the biggest things that comes out when I'm looking at these companies, and we've categorized them to the best of our ability under certain headings, but in many cases, I mean, for example, there's no company under the fabrication pillar that is an analog, even on a smaller scale, to what a TSMC would do. They're still very focused and narrow on a particular technology that couldn't feed the rest of these companies in the spectrum. So there's so much diversity, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in terms of the technology and the needs. Cochlear, you mentioned, we had some discussions with them, and they're a very successful technology company for Australia. They do some fabrication, but in the medical space, the needs that they have are quite different from new communications technologies. They rely more on older fabrication processes, things that are going to stay for a long period of time inside a human body. So there's all sorts of other needs that a company like Cochlear would have. Where we are extremely strong is in historically and today is RF and radar. Companies like CEA Technologies, EM Solutions. These are all strong Australian companies that often service the defense industry, aerospace, telecommunications, and there could be opportunity to consolidate some capability in Australia that services that space explicitly. So yeah, I think this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, and there's also startup companies as well that I'm excited about, because when I talk about time frame, in some sense I do mean it's a long-term investment. And just to speak a little bit about my own space in quantum computing, there's a lot being talked about right now, but in terms of a high throughput manufacturing capability or need today, there isn't one. But in 10 years, 15 years, what is that going to look like? And secondly, what is the technology going to be? It may not be CMOS, where we're very intense right now. It may be something different. And so this is kind of what I mean by us looking strategically at and gradually at unearthing the opportunity for Australia to carve out a niche in a space that is going to have that is going to pay dividends in the long term.
Was there and we'll talk to Andrew about this as well, in terms of the market direction in this? Is there a specific, you sort of mentioned we don't know what technologies are coming, but we must have sort of some insights or best guesses as well. In terms of the outcomes of this report and having sort of read it, unless you're in the market, does it provide you with a bit of a potential roadmap of what you'll be looking at next? Or I suppose the key question is, who is this report written for? Is it at an economic level, political level, or all, in terms of the market, or at a research level? Who would be the best audience for this? And again, the direction that we're heading in the semiconductor area as well.
Okay, yeah, great questions. I mean, one thing I failed to say earlier, and we were pretty try to be very careful about this, is we wanted to decouple this as much as possible from the University of Sydney, but also academic research more broadly. and make this very much an industry-focused study. So my contribution was from a technical point of view and a connection point of view, and then we had a lot of economic business through the consultant that we brought on. He brought that expertise and lens. Who is it written for? That's a great question. I think to some extent it's about educating people like myself and people like the CEOs of the companies that are out there that we spoke to.
And people like me who, again, trying to keep a grasp of these sectors that are very complex.
Yeah.
And I think this is why you've done it so well. But again, I'm looking at this particular figure from a sort of an industry analyst, and even that economic analyst looking at the listed companies there on the left under ASIC and going, okay, where do they fit? And then where is their business now? And then the overall sort of opportunities there. And I'm also, again, from that industry analyst, I think we mentioned Taiwan, looking at the risks in that supply chain as well is very, very important from a business risk and supply chain risk element as well. I think it might not be the initial audience that was written for, but I'm seeing it with those eyes.
Yeah, there's a lot in this, even just this little part of the discussion we're having right now. I think the motive, if I just say, well, what are the motivations of doing a report like this? One of them is as an education piece to get people talking and get different types of people talking, like you and I. I look at this with a certain perspective, and I see perhaps a naive kind of research perspective, but important because it does fit into this value chain as well. There's also, and so economically, can we get the eyes of government at the state and national level, and indeed we already have the chief scientist as a very strong supporter of this, and can we get investment to build this to build innovation in Australia, and that has an economic impact.
Yeah. Also, well, I can say that Drone Shield is here under fabrication. We just carried a story with them yesterday, and Pyne and Partners, the former Defence Minister Christopher Pyne has been appointed by Drone Shield in terms of his firm. So you do have that direct link back. There's a number of defence companies there as well. So I'm imagining politically and defence-wise, there'll be eyes over this as well. Let's just cognizant of time as well. Let me just walk through a couple of others. And again, the idea here is for the audience, the report is available obviously at University of Sydney, but also on the marketplace for us. So you can just go there and do a search for semiconductors and it will come up. This then starts to talk into the broad characteristics of the value chain relevant to Australia. And we might skip this one because again, we talked about that granular aspect, and then these types. This is the semiconductor sector levers and potential interventions. Where do you fit into this part, James? Which arrow is yours? What can you comment on in something like this?
Well, I guess so. If you're speaking directly to the levers, I won't speak to this slide partly because it's hard to see the.
Yeah, I'm just.
But I know the slide you're talking about. Basically, what comes out at the end of this is a whole bunch of things that we could do here in Australia to stimulate an industry, essentially. And if you ask specifically where I might have some overlap, well, it's definitely going to be in the innovation space and the skills and talent development space. If this is to work, we need to eventually have a steady stream of good talent coming into these companies from universities or colleges or TAFEs or whatever they are. And so in the type of work I'm doing, where we're very much at the border of research and commercialization, industry development, we're developing and innovating those new technologies that could eventually be serviced by something like the semiconductor industry that will be. And then we're also training new people to participate in that and feed into the growing ecosystem. I want to also say, I know you're following the slides. I want to also just say it's highly relevant, and we spoke about this in our last phone call, is the security, the national security aspect and the sovereign capability aspect of what we're doing. It's both, if this works, if we can move down this path and grow an industry, we will innovate. It's inevitable that innovation will happen, and it will spawn new innovation, and it will grow. And so from an economic and financial point of view, there's huge benefits. But there's also, and this is a timely, it's timely to speak about this, is that we may get cut off from a Taiwanese manufacturer, or we may, there's risks around IP and so on. I don't know great details, but I'm sure things have happened, and there's a lot of concern around IP getting stolen when it's being manufactured and so on. So what can we do to bring in as much of that capability as possible into Australia, where we have control over it, and perhaps there's certainly would be servicing, maybe other countries would be coming to us to have work done in whatever niche area is chosen. So that's another angle.
There's a clear divide there between sort of China and the US and the sort of the Five Eyes countries as well in terms of their technology and the sovereignty. And we've covered a lot of that in relation to space and defence as well. But it just touches on all technology in that what we're using as well in terms of all communications in our systems. So look, this is the last sort of figure out of it. This is the pathways to growing the Australian semiconductor sector. And again, the report identifies sort of where Australia is at the moment and some of those key opportunities and where it can find those niche markets. And as we mentioned, it covers off on universities, obviously the research, industry, government and defence. So it's well worth a read, if even as a sort of general technologist being across this, and even not even the Australian market, if you're in any of the semiconductor markets, it'd be well worth to read. This is a free report. Normally you would pay for something like this as well. So look, on that, James, let's keep you on, because I think we'll start to talk about the broader semiconductor sector once we have Andrew on. And again, the next, let's introduce Andrew. It's a beautiful segue, and it's why we invited Senetas when I got the press release. Andrew Wilson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me on your show.
Very good. Great. And look, our CEO of Senetas, ASX-listed company, and I think I'd already reached out to James on this report, and then I got the Senetas media release announcing the first quantum-resistant network encryption capability. And James, I think we'd had our first conversation and quantum came up, and that's why the red flag went off. Andrew, ASX listed since '99. You've been the CEO since 2012.
2012, that's right.
Introduce us to Senetas and the work that you're doing, and then we'll dive into quantum encryption.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's a great Australian story. It started off, I guess, in 1997 when Senetas was a venture capital company, and we acquired an interest in a small startup company that specialised in high-speed encryption. And in those days, high speed was less than 10 megabit. Right?
Yeah, wow.
And it was 3 people in a disused bank that was repurposed for an R&D facility in Ashburton in Melbourne, and they developed the world's first high-speed ATM encryptor, which worked across asynchronous transfer mode networks. And they sold that product to an Australian government agency, and I can't name customers, unfortunately. In our space, it's very difficult. And that gave them their start. And it's a great example of where a government agency has taken a risk on a genuinely innovative technology from Australia to give this company its first sales. And from there, this company grew to supply the world's first 10 gigabit SONET encryptor to a US government defense agency. Again, I can't name them. It sort of underscores the sort of innovative capability in this country, and we've built upon that over the past 20 years, if you can believe that we've been around for over 20 years. It's amazing. To supply our products, classical encryption technology specialising in high-speed data transmissions, encryption of data transmissions, to 45 different countries around the world, anywhere from North America right through to the Middle East and parts of Asia and also Latin America.
And so does that remains your niche, is network encryption?
High-speed network
Not devices or storage or anything like that. It's networks?
Yep, high-speed network encryption. They're hardware devices that we deploy into a customer premises where that customer manages the encryption keys and encrypts data at very high speeds, anywhere from 10 meg right up to 100 gigabits per second, in various use cases, from data center interconnect communications to wide area networks in a meshed and multi-point mode, to branch area communications, and those sorts of things. It's fair to say that most of our customers, I guess, in those early years, and by early I mean the first 15 years when nobody could spell encryption. Thankfully, these days I don't have to explain what encryption is anymore. So we have, I guess, a mix of roughly 70% defence commercial, 70% defence and government, to 30% commercial enterprises. So it's good to see the commercial sector taking encryption seriously. And I guess all of our technology is designed and developed in Melbourne by engineers based in Melbourne. We do have some business development staff that are helping our partners in overseas markets, our main partner being Thales globally.
Yeah. They're your distributor, right?
Our distributor, that's right.
Yeah.
So they help us with market coverage that we couldn't afford to replicate, and that's very important. But all of our product is designed and developed in Melbourne and manufactured by an organisation called Extel, which is also based in Melbourne, which is a high-tech manufacturer in this country. And I think a lot of our customers globally find that reassuring, that our product is designed and developed and manufactured in Australia. But as James said, we're still reliant on the global supply chain of components, and so his report is very timely in relation to the concerns that company directors should have in relation to the supply of components for the manufacturing of telecommunication devices and just about everything else that we use in the electronic world and digital age, and where those components come from. So,
just out of interest, were you aware of the report before?
No, I wasn't aware of the report. In fact, I wasn't aware that Australia was even looking at this area of resilience. I was aware that the US is considering and is indeed establishing boundaries and various things like that to ensure that the supply of these semiconductors and critical components can be procured.
Let's move into quantum briefly, but I was going to sort of talk about, you talked about your supply chain and sort of where you've seen the market. What's brought you into the quantum space? Is that something that you're seeing the market go to, or are you trying to be preemptive and just understand the quantum sector? What's that link from your traditional network encryption and then moving into quantum? It's quantum capable encryption, right? So it's encryption that will withstand a quantum attack, right?
Yeah. So I mean, we're involved in encryption and the strength of the encryption that we deploy, and we deploy, standards-based encryption in our product. But with the advent of a quantum encryptor versus a classical computation device, computer, that stores information as a 1 or 0, a quantum computer can transmit and store information not just as a 1 or a 0, but anything in between. Right? So its ability to perform complex mathematical calculations exponentially increases because it's not tethered to a 1 or 0. It can be either state at the same time or any state in between. And this enables the quantum computer to perform calculations that might take billions of years into a matter of minutes. Yep. And once that quantum computer reaches a certain power, defined in qubits, It will be able to render classical encryption technologies insecure, RSA, elliptic curve computations, for example. And Peter Shaw, an American mathematician with Shaw's algorithm, proved this, that once a quantum computer could reach a certain power, then classical encryption algorithms would become practically useless. So having watched this space and being concerned with the security of our customers that we've supplied product to, we've invested in implementing quantum resistant algorithms, and the candidate algorithms are published by NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. So we can deploy all of those candidate quantum resistant algorithms in our device today. We have quantum random noise sources embedded in our product. We can support quantum key distribution technologies and the ETSI standard, so that we can ensure that in this post-quantum world, we can migrate our customers to ensure that they're secure in the post-quantum environment. So that's our innovation, and we believe we're the world first in that space to deliver that capability, which means our customers can upgrade in the field using our same devices to ensure that they're secure in the process.
Okay, I was smiling because I've got about 100 questions going in that. My first one was going to be, do you require new devices? Like if you, from a customer, is it, I take it this is hardware-driven encryption, not software-driven.
Well, it's interesting because we develop our encryptors based on an FPGA, which is a field programmable gate array, which can be upgraded in the field, unlike ASICs, which cannot be upgraded in the field. So we can supply upgrade images to our existing customers without replacing the hardware, meaning that once NIST defines the new, whatever quantum resistant algorithm it specifies, then our customers can upgrade in the field, which won't require truck rolling new hardware. So we think that's pretty compelling for our customer base. And we're getting quite a bit of interest in that capability from our existing customers.
Is this market ready?
Yeah, it's market ready right now. I mean, obviously, the standards are still settling down, but our customers can today play with those candidate algorithms and understand what the behaviour characteristics are, what the performance advantages and disadvantages are, in order to get ready for when that final algorithm is decided by NIST.
The other thing I was going to say is I'm very impressed. You started with this as CFO initially with the company, and you've nailed your descriptors on encryption, and it's always been a bugbear of mine.
I appreciate that.
In my
cyber, my CTO could do a better job. But,
I'd be scared to bring him on
if process of osmosis over 20 years. I've been with the company since 2000. So
you're right. Okay, and I take it this is why it's an ASX listed company, because it was originally a VC company. So the team,
VC company in the .com.
They do.
Boom. And then we had to adapt our business model when that period ended, and
from an investor's viewpoint, how do you find your shareholder base? Is there anything interesting in your shareholder base and your main shareholders? Obviously, they need to understand this space.
Well, understanding encryption doesn't come easily, I don't think, to the market, so it is difficult to explain. But we really see the market opportunity for our innovation to be significant for our shareholder base. We do have some other investments as well, and we have virtualized our encryption technology, so it can be deployed on various hardware that's not our own. But and they do have some use cases, but we do think that there is a growth opportunity for our innovation and our company in this space.
James, to bring you back in, obviously you've got experience in quantum and quantum computing, and maybe you can talk more from sort of the Nano Institute as well of what is happening around sort of quantum encryption and quantum computing, and where your observations or take on what you're doing with Senetas. And I understand you've crossed paths with Senetas in the past.
Yeah, a long time ago. I mean, let me just say, there's quite a bit of irony listening to Andrew, because here we have the CEO explaining the quantum physics details very well, I might add, and the physicist talking about supply chains. And so you're having a bit of fun here, Andrew. This is great.
We could swap roles.
Oh, you know what? I think I can. I can swap. There you go. Swap that around.
I've always wanted to be a CEO.
Very funny.
Yeah. So let me I'll talk a little bit about the University of Sydney. We have, like I said, there's two commercial activities going on. There's one that's being run by Professor David Riley, who was the originator of some of the technology, and he's employed now by Microsoft, and Microsoft has taken up residence in part of the Sydney Nano hub, and basically leased some space, and they've hired a bunch of people. So it's a really exciting opportunity and situation for the university to have such a big commercial company investing in our talent, in our capability to build a quantum computer. We also have a company called Q-Control, which was founded by Professor Michael Bierczak, who you may have seen on TV and radio because he's often presenting in various forums. And he's founded a company called Q-Control, and they're kind of what you might think of as a firmware, quantum firmware. That's how they describe themselves, as kind of the interface between the quantum algorithms and software and the complexities of the hardware. So maybe just in terms of the whole global situation with quantum computing, there are a lot of big players now: IBM, Microsoft, Google, Intel. They're all at the table and making advances. Materials science and the hardware seems to be kind of the slowest part. It's like there's still quite a bit of work to do to really resolve and get the quantum chips, the qubits, operating as noise-free and proof as possible. I should also mention there's another company in Sydney at UNSW called Silicon Quantum Computing, and that's Michelle Simmons and Drew Zirak were connected to that. I think now it's Michelle Simmons is running that company. So Sydney is a great hub of it, and Melbourne has a lot of activity as well.
Well, notice I'll bring in sort of Deacon. How much are you doing at the academic level, Andrew, in terms of both that advanced research, or do you, again, from a company perspective, you go out and you buy that tech? What's your approach in that regards for new technology? For example, your quantum network capability or encryption capability, how did you come about that? Did you do that in-house, or did you license that out? What was the process?
No, we developed that in-house, leveraging the candidate algorithms that are published by NIST.
Yeah.
We have a partnership with a company called ID Quantique, and we've purchased their quantum random noise sources and embedded that in our technology. And obviously we've architected the software to ensure that our devices can support those new technologies. And
they're Australian too?
ID Quantique is Swiss.
Ah, okay, got it. Yeah. Is there a reason, and I'm not having a go at the Swiss, but did you go across the market? Was there options there, or?
Well, not at the time, because we've had a relationship with ID Quantique since 2006.
Yeah.
So at that time there was no nobody could spell the word quantum like they couldn't spell the word encryption. But we've had a long-standing relationship with that organisation.
So again, you are developing your products and with partners and on sort of ongoing partnerships. What's your observations of the Australian sector, as sort of James pointed out? I mean, James, you've been able to rattle off sort of half a dozen companies here in Sydney in this space. I've seen a little bit out at University of Sydney as well. I've gone to some demonstrations, but yeah, maybe what your observations from a pure frontline commercial sector?
I think there's a great opportunity for companies like ours to collaborate with universities. It traditionally hasn't been terribly easy from a to take the idea from research into commercialization. And I think there is work to be done to fill that gap, to ensure that a commercial organisation like ours can take an idea from research or into the development stage. So I think there are opportunities, and to be honest, this is where ID Quantique was a spin-off from the University of Geneva, and it had a program for PhDs where the PhD student was working on a QKD approach, quantum key distribution technology, said to the PhD students, hands up who would like to set up a startup, right? We'll fund it to a certain point. Here are the technology licensing rights and the patent licensing rights. We'll help you raise some money, and we'll retain an interest in board positions and help you commercialize this invention that you worked on at the University of Geneva. I thought that was, at the time, a pretty innovative approach to spinning off intellectual property that the commercial world just doesn't have the resources to spend time on, where it involves big R with not necessarily a known time frame to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And at the time, I remember having a discussion with the CEO of that company, and he said, how long is this going to take me to commercialize this product when nobody understands what quantum is? I said, it could take 20 years, mate.
That's
almost right.
Well, it sounds like it, but at least they're still going, I think, 14 years later. But you are up against some of the bigger players, the multinationals like the Microsofts and the IBMs and others in terms of Chinese companies and what they're doing. Maybe let's finish off again on time, because we could literally talk about all day. And maybe just finish off on that VC sector, James. Are you seeing much activity around venture capital, sort of looking around and working with some of the startups coming through? Is there much VC interest in?
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, there is a lot of interest, and the last question you asked, I think, is one of the most important things. Is that here we are, we're sitting here. Andrew is the CEO of a company, and I'm a technical researcher at a university, and it's bridging these two areas, the expertise. There's a lot of unknowns for scientists, and equally for CEOs, and it's about us interacting more and identifying how we can work together, and that's hard. That is the hardest thing, because there's so many other barriers like communication and expectations and so on. So that's what I have a passion for here, and that's my role at Sydney Nano. Now, in terms of VCs, going back to that, Andrew, we were speaking just before that. When I was at Melbourne, we were doing some work on single photon sources for quantum key distribution, and Senetas was there. We were speaking to you, and I think we had some joint funding arrangements, and so very much you've been at that table at the forefront in innovation. At least that was in 2005, and I have a chart that plots venture capital interest in quantum-related technologies from that time. So back then there was ID Quantique. There's a company called Magic Q, which you probably know.
It doesn't exist anymore, does it?
I don't think so, but I don't know where they ended up. And then there was then there's D-Wave, the quantum computing company in Vancouver. Three companies that really kind of had some capital. And now in 2018, 2019, 2020, there's been exponential growth. And now, so in Sydney in particular, and I think Australia-wide, the CSIRO has a venture capital subsidiary called Main Sequence Ventures, and they've invested in Q Control, the company that I mentioned here. There's a company in Canberra. I'm not sure if Main Sequence has invested, but they're called
Quintessence.
Yeah, there's Quintessence, and there's Quantum Brilliance, which is quantum computing, and Silicon Quantum Computing also has investment. So they're definitely investing, and that's exciting for us because, well, there's a couple of PhD students next door who I spoke to last year, and they had an idea, a quantum-related idea, and they've since formed a company, and they're going through the process of.
Yeah, great.
path. They see a path that's been paved. They see that there could be a way to go this direction rather than going the conventional academic direction. So it's exciting in that regard for us to see.
It is
definitely one to watch. Sorry, Andrew, go.
And just to your point, Chris, and your point, James, investment in the quantum space and developing a quantum computer that is of sufficient power requires huge capital resources that only organisations like Google, Microsoft, IBM can deploy, and the resources that can be deployed by a country, for example. I just read an article today on the University of Science and Technology in China, just having proved the computational supremacy of a quantum computer, where they performed a complicated mathematical equation that might have taken a classical computer 2 billion years in a matter of minutes. But have you seen the size of that thing? It would take up an entire room. So the investment in those sorts of technologies is beyond what I would think would be something affordable by Australian research organisations or companies. But it is finding that niche, I think.
I think this is where something we try to do here is look for those opportunities for Australia, because you're right, we can't do it all. We mentioned Quintessence Lab. When I first heard of them, they were actually already moved to the US. They can't do all of their work here in Australia, and they end up moving out of Australia. And I think that's something that we've it's always sad to see, and I think that's something that we're trying to cover off on. What are those real sweet spots that Australia can get involved with? We do have a comment from Pierre. Let me just bring up, and James, he's read the report at least. Someone has, and congratulations on an extensive and well-crafted report. Let me just bring on his question, and then we'll finish up. What should happen next to develop this Australian Semiconductor initiative? A linked project between industry, defence was mentioned. Is it the only way? Any roadblocks? Maybe with that, maybe hand over to Andrew, because you already work. I mean, that's a good link there already with Thales. In that you found that partner. Is that something, James? If you're sort of a small startup, you would potentially, through the initiatives that we see in New South Wales, but also at the sort of federal innovation hubs, partner with a defence company in that?
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from our perspective, it has enabled us to reach markets that as a small Australian company we could not have afforded to have reached. And if you're doing business with the US government, you need a strong American company that can interface with those customers effectively.
And brings trust as well. And go, James.
Well, I was going to say it's a big part of what we're doing more and more of as well, partnering with defence. And just to answer the question about what should happen next, I mean, what should happen next, I think, is that we do more of this innovation, this interaction across to identify where the needs are. But the idea of this Bureau service is kind of what we're lobbying to get happening here. And what is the roadblock? Well, the roadblock is, I mean, I don't want to call it a roadblock. The need is commitment from government on a long-term, sustained basis to strategically invest.
I couldn't agree more.
This new technology, because without that, you will not have risk-taking companies take any risk. So that's the sum of it, I think, is we need that. And so we need to convince the government. And so that's why these conversations are important.
Okay, well, look, we'll leave it on there. Thank you to the comments as well. I don't know if it's always government, though, but even if they just create the space, but I'll keep that in mind in terms of what's next. And likewise, gents, hopefully we can have you back on into the future. It's something we'll cover. We have covered quantum a little bit, but we'll stay tuned on these. And Senetas, you're now on my watch list for ASX listed security and defence companies. So we'll be monitoring that. You've been doing quite well recently. So
thank you very much.
It always comes down to volume, doesn't it? But
it always comes down to volume.
Absolutely. And James, likewise, I think in terms of our audience, putting this report out in front of them is well worthwhile. And I like the way it's come out of New South Wales. We've done a bit in Adelaide and what they're doing over there in that defence sector, the sort of AC3 and the like. So be monitoring what other reports are coming out, that because it can get competitive as well. You know, Sydney will want to have most of that chunk of the industry, and that's the trouble with government. They can get in the way sometimes. So, look, on that note, thank you so much. Absolute pleasure. We've gone over time. We were joined by Andrew Wilson, the CEO of Senetas, and Professor James Rabeau, Professor of Physics at the University of Sydney. So thank you very much, and Sydney Nano Institute. Absolute pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, James. Nice to see you again.
Good on you. I'm just going to do my close, couple more slides, but I'll put you both backstage. Thanks again, guys. I'll send you the links and I'll send you an email. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Cheers. Okay, that was great. Slightly over time, so I'm not going to spend too much time. Report of the day was the Notifiable Data Breaches report here in Australia, and the breakdown. This is the 6 months from. This is comparison. So this is the July to December report, and the comparisons between January to June 2020. So basically, the second half of 2020, up 5% the number of notifications, and it still keeps ticking up. Malicious and criminal attacks is down by 1%, so hardly much move there. And then we've got an up 18% rise in human error, and that was kind of the key takeaway. Human error still remains a significant issue in cybersecurity breach notifications, and no change in system faults. So again, always comes down to cybersecurity awareness, and particularly for enterprise as well. Now, a great segue into next week, and hopefully I might even put Dr. Shushmita Rouge on notice in terms of what they're doing with AI and potentially even on quantum, and get a bit of a takeaway in terms of the CSIRO. But we'll also be joined by Dr. Jed Horner from Standards Australia, looking at the Cybersecurity Task Force recommendations. So looking forward to that. That'll be 10 a.m. on Friday, Australian Eastern Standard Daylight Saving Time. And that's it from us at the marketplace. And stay tuned. I'm just making sure I've got no more slides. Watch out for the Seagate. Here we go. Seagate Part 2 with Jeff Park, the ANZ Country Manager at Seagate, and looking at the Skyhawk hard drives. So thank you very much. Enjoy your afternoon. Pleasure.